Sarah Watson, Director of the Murphy Institute at CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. Thank you for joining us today for the program Intersectional Organizing, Building Solidarity in the Labor and LGBTQIA+ movements. This program is the first in a new public forum series that highlights the intersections of LGBTQIA+ activism and the labor movement, and it's organized as part of SLU's participation in the CUNY LGBTQIA+ Consortium. It's made possible through the generous support of LaGuardia Community College and the New York City Council LGBT and Queer Caucus. As we witness increased attacks on the rights and safety of LGBTQIA+ people, especially transgendered individuals, as well as an unprecedented assault on workers' rights, I'm so appreciative to our speakers, Brittany Murray, Jez Brizak, and our moderator, Joanna Weist, for being with us today to discuss how queer organizers build community within their workplaces to support civil rights and social justice movements, as well as to share some strategies for building power to defend our workplaces and vulnerable communities. Before I introduce Joanna and turn the program over to her, I want to share some info on upcoming public programs here at the Murphy Institute. The Civic Engagement and Leadership Development Program is underway, and there's one more public program in the series that's happening this Friday at 12 p.m. ET on Zoom. Also, please save the date. On May 8th and May 9th, SLU will host a two-day conference titled Labor and the Crisis of Democracy, Working Class Politics in the Age of Authoritarianism. My colleagues Michael and Nadia have shared info on these upcoming programs in the chat. I also want to take a moment to thank them for all of their work behind the scenes on today's program. It's now my pleasure to welcome Joanna. Joanna is an assistant professor in women's, gender, and sexuality studies at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and she's also the author of the article Queer Working Class Politics and the U.S. Labor Movement, which appeared in the Murphy Institute's journal, New Labor Forum, in the spring of 2024. Joanna, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you everyone else for being here today, especially during this moment when sharing strategies for organizing seems kind of more important than ever before. I want to thank you also to our incredible panelists for joining us today and sharing their insights from the trenches of labor organizing. So to introduce them, we'll be hearing today from Jez Brizak, a union organizer and co-founder of Starbucks Workers United and Inside Organizer School, the latter of which trains workers to organize. And in addition to organizing workers across the region and advising organizing committees at companies like Tesla and Ben & Jerry's, Jez is the author of the forthcoming book, Get on the Job and Organize, out next month from Simon & Schuster Press. We are also lucky to be joined by Brittany Murray, who serves as co-president on the executive board of the AFL-CIO constituency group, Pride at Work, as well as the United Steelworkers Union's Civil and Human Rights Department. She has also worked with numerous other advocacy and labor organizing groups in Pittsburgh. So we're going to spend the next hour or so trying to understand why attacks on LGBTQ rights today are so entwined with the assaults on labor laws and institutions, and why it's so important to understand that fact when we think about organizing strategies for fighting back. And that is too often, I think, that state laws that undermine trans and gay rights, for instance, are discussed separately from the long and recent intensifying war on organized labor. The national media gave due attention a few years ago to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis's infamous Don't Say Gay bill, which restricted public schools' curricular content and was championed by those who fear-mongered about grooming, was the language there, grooming predatory queer teachers. But missing from much of that conversation was the fact that the law was passed just before DeSantis signed the Paycheck Protection Act. And that was an Orwellian-named piece of legislation that has made it difficult for teachers' unions, among others, to collect the dues that make their existence possible and advocacy for their members and their students possible. And as someone like Christopher Ruffe made very clear, the attacks on trans kids and the basic panic over things like critical race theory, they're part of a larger agenda. And in his words, actually, to get to universal school choice, and I think we should understand that as privatization, pure and simple, he said you really need to understand You really need to operate, rather, from a premise of universal public school distrust. And as we know, the gutting of public education is a de facto attack on public sector unions. Similarly, we can see that much of the anti-DEI talk within the current presidential administration serves as an excuse to cut down the federal public sector workforce. And that is including those civil servants who run environmental justice programs at agencies like the EPA and others who enforce federal labor law against corporations. And so with that, I want to take us to our first question, which will get us talking about what to do about these entwined threats to public goods, organized labor, and minority civil rights. And so I want to ask both of you, in your own experience, how have you seen organizing workers and/or established labor unions improve LGBTQ workers' lives, and more broadly create bonds of solidarity among diverse workers?
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. And also thank you to CUNY SLU for this opportunity to speak with everyone today. From my experience, the way the labor movement has really benefited LGBTQIA plus workers and community members at large is that it has shaped the way that we generate policy, procedure, and contractual language underneath employment. People do not just come to jobs and then not return to a community at the end of the day. So folks that are actively working within their community are able to broaden and provide resources to one another. And ultimately, having language within these contracts, within these policies, act as a greater and broader protection for every worker, for every employee. Most of us don't go to work to just work for ourselves. We obviously have dependents. So broadening the language also supports them as well, because sometimes the worker may not be queer or trans, but the dependents may be, right? So having expansive medical policy language, having expansions on discrimination language to protect workers in the workplace only helps everyone in the long run. But ultimately, what we have done, or what we have seen, especially by LGBTQIA plus workers underneath the labor movement, is kind of like a coalescing of what our basic human rights are. And also helps to generate and provide a space, a very protective space of people being able to stand up and champion their rights, the instances of when they have faced or navigated oppression or discriminatory action on the job. And it also just builds outright solidarity. You know, my struggle is your struggle. We are unified in all of this, right? Our destinies are intertwined. So having the capacity to mobilize, to organize is integral to us. And it also helps to deal with some of the pervasive miseducation, right? It's very hard to like discriminate or perpetuate bigoted rhetoric towards somebody when you know them, when they're your coworker, when they're with you in the struggle, when you're organizing side by side for all of the same intrinsic human rights, inalienable human rights, but also for benefits on the job, protections on the job, and workplace safety. When you have workers working together in that capacity, everybody becomes more safe. Everyone's wages get better. Everyone's work environment becomes better. And having that inclusivity is so vital, which is why it is so rampantly under attack, because the divisive nature of all of this rhetoric helps to undermine employees' capacity to organize and to fight back against the oppression that they are facing by their bosses or within these industries and sectors. And that's the goal ultimately, is to keep us divided, to keep us pocket watching each other, as we like to say in the Black community, and to make us skeptical of one another, or to assume that everyone is backstabbing or undermining the other, right? And all that does is to dissuade individuals from collective bargaining or organizing. And that's ultimately what our oppressors want from us. They don't want us organized. They don't want us coming together. They don't want us fighting for our rightful share of our own production. So this is just an overall attack on workers in general.
Well, thank you so much, Brittany. And Jez, I don't know, did you have thoughts on that opening question?
Yes, thanks so much. And yeah, thanks to everybody for having me. I think what Brittany said was spot on. I mean, I think from campaigns like Starbucks Workers United, where, Starbucks is an overwhelmingly queer workforce where most workers are somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum, to, you know, what you would consider like the more stereotypical, you know, factory worker kind of environment. Like the labor movement has this tremendous power for bringing people together and truly unifying people in a way that goes beyond sort of, you know, nice platitudes about inclusion, or worse, corporate co-optation around inclusion and, you know, kind of tokenistic DEI initiatives, and truly giving people the empowerment to be able to advocate for themselves and each other, and to really give language to why our liberation is so entwined. So like at Starbucks, you know, you had a company that was virtue signaling every day about how it was a different kind of company, how it was doing collaborations with Lady Gaga, and, you know, had special Born This Way mugs for purchase in the cafe, but then was obviously discriminating against trans workers in a variety of ways. And, you know, when workers started organizing, was disproportionately targeting trans workers, and like fired people right before their gender affirming surgery. That was the very reason they had come to Starbucks in the first place. So Starbucks workers in Oklahoma City who were organizing formed the union largely to protect themselves and each other from that kind of retaliation. And a worker came up with the slogan that became a defining slogan of the campaign, which was "Trans rights are labor rights and class liberation is queer liberation." And I think so many workers, you know, are organizing and are seeing unions as a way not just to, you know, win wages, benefits, and working conditions, which was what Starbucks tried to tell us, you know, that's all a union can do. Like, you know, you are just going to be able to negotiate about your pay and benefits, but actually as this vehicle for true social transformation, when all of these other institutions that are supposed to protect people are clearly falling apart or are incapable of actually dealing with the systemic issues.
Yeah, I love what you both have said here, and I wrote down from something you said, Brittany. This is kind of thinking about how corporations might do things on behalf of in a really thin way. But when we're talking about organizing across a very diverse workforce, we're talking about doing things with each other. And I think that's a really useful way to think about what's so different here. And that kind of goes into actually my second question, which is I am very curious what you all make about this explosion of corporate America's support for things like racial justice and LGBTQ and trans rights a few years ago. And I think what we've seen is its really subsequent rapid decline over the last few years. And for instance, we saw massive capital boycotts back in 2016, even over North Carolina's notorious anti-trans bathroom ban law, and a deluge of corporate funding for racial justice issues in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. And picking up on some themes that you've said, Jazz, here, Starbucks in particular went from positioning itself as this corporate vanguard for trans rights to taking down pride decorations and even framing trans healthcare as something that might disappear in a unionized workplace setting. And so I guess my question for both of you is, where did all of that corporate support go? And what does it say about the underlying motivation of that previous support? And importantly, how have and should workers respond to those seemingly thin corporate commitments to social justice?
Yeah, so I have a lot to say about this, and I have for many years, because you know, I've worked within the veil or under the veil of labor activism for a long time, but I come out of grassroots activism, right? Civil rights activism, and I know a thing or two about co-opting movements. The co-optimization, if you will, of movements, and how it stifles and stagnates movements overall. You know, if you're ever, for anyone watching, doing anything that is meant to like undermine or uproot, you know, systematic oppression, or, you know, to redefine what these systems actually mean for the general public in a corporation or a longstanding institution. Even if it's labeled as a nonprofit. In Pittsburgh, we have UPMC, it's University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and a nonprofit they are not, they make billions of dollars. But even if those folks start championing, saying, yeah, no, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, we stand with you, we stand behind you. Stop, pause, question everything, because the co-opting of your movement is absolutely happening. And what I know is the way that I've been labeling this is something that my grandmother always said, which is the carrot or the stick. So we've seen the carrot, right? DEI, pride, the rainbow movement underneath like corporate leadership, everything else, right? Like, oh yeah, we believe in racial justice, we believe in social justice. And now we're receiving the stick, which is there's a new administration in town, there's new rhetoric. Corporations that felt like their bottom dollar has been penetrated or harmed by their previous co-opting of these movements, and now they are moving in another direction because all corporations care about at the end of the day is their profit margins. All they care about is their ability to buy stocks. All they care about is their ability to gain further investments. So ultimately, corporations as entities are never going to actually move with our movements, right? Our social justice movements, even our labor rights movements, because corporations are inherently, frankly, anti-labor. For them, it's a matter of like, to what extent can I exploit the worker for my benefit? And they will perform this exploitation both nationally and globally by any means necessary. So to me, it was like the natural cycle of an ending of events, right? So like we came to the end of their co-opting of said movement because it was no longer deemed profitable or beneficial for them. And ultimately, it took nothing for them to undo it because in reality, short of like glad handing money between each other or pushing money into like some of these major nonprofits, which doesn't always trickle down to the communities that frankly need it, there was no real tangible investment made in any of this. It's why it was so easy to take away. If people were questioning, well, how did things become anti-LGBTQIA plus or anti-DEI overnight? It's because they never made any legitimate, tangible investment, neither in policy, culture, or infrastructure. So it didn't matter. There was really no loss for them. And as far as they're concerned, they're forecasting what potential gains there are to be had for undermining this previously co-opted movement. So I'm not shocked, and I wasn't shocked from the start because I had a real problem with like the co-option and rainbowizing of our movement underneath corporations and corporations throwing money at different pride events and corporations putting up rainbows and all the things, because ultimately my question was always, well, what are you actually doing for your community where you exist, and what are you actually doing for your workers where they exist within your institution? Ultimately, legitimate, tangible investments into people would have looked like raising their wages without them having to organize, right? And they were never going to be interested in doing that. So I'm not shocked. I think it's a natural end to the co-optization of our movement, and I think it's time we take it back.
Yeah, I think going off of that, like the first campaign that I worked on was the UAW's effort to organize Nissan in Mississippi. And a couple of years before I started working on the campaign, the union had adopted the labor rights or civil rights message. This was a factory that was about 80% Black, and management was using every kind of, historically based white supremacist trope to try to prevent the union from coming in. And so the union was trying to, build solidarity between the union's movement and the civil rights struggles that were ongoing in the plant. And Nissan's response, when they had never taken a particularly involved stance before, was to suddenly start making all of these donations to groups, ranging from the NAACP, local Black churches, to the Sierra Club. They had just come out with their first EV, to the Nashville Pride Parade. So they were trying to, drape themselves in all of these flags and banners in order to deflect attention from the union busting that they were doing in the plant. And also to try to, make organizations that were now getting Nissan funding have to question, should we speak out about this union busting, or is that going to affect our budget? And so I think that was, an effective corporate strategy, but it also shows, one, the hollowness of a lot of these corporate initiatives, but also the effect that, their perceived public opinion polling has. So like, for example, Ben and Jerry's is doubling down because they're reading the room and understanding that their customers are going to respond poorly if they walk that back. Whereas Nissan did just roll it back because they're perceiving that, it's advantageous for them to just drop their mask and go back to being, fascist or explicitly neoliberal capitalism. So I think, we know that these things are hollow, but we also have to figure out the ways to leverage like what these companies want in order to win the right to organize, especially.
Yeah, it's so important to note that there are some corporations that are still thinking that whether it's their customer base or maybe somebody at the top wants to and thinks it's lucrative to keep investing in this kind of that they haven't thrown out the pride banners, I guess. They have some rainbow flags hanging around. And particularly, I remember also like Costco got some really great press for saying that they were not going to change their corporate DEI policies. But we also know that there's some union struggles that are going on right now in that corporation as well. And that I think that nicely transitions into another question I had, which is something you both are already kind of hitting on. But I'm curious about what is different about organizing queer workers as workers, and how does that contrast with a more sort of liberal or nonprofit approach that usually advocates on behalf of LGBTQ people of all classes? And I ask that because I'm reminded of the Human Rights Campaign soft pitch to Republicans in 2004 that they would entertain supporting Social Security privatization in return for recognition of gay and lesbian partners in that program. And sadly, I think that that's a relevant question for us to entertain in the present. And I also remember a few years ago, I walked into a major LGBTQ nonprofits annual conference, and I was hit instantly with a giant advertising booth for pharmaceutical companies, particularly Gilead, which appears to have made hundreds of millions of dollars on publicly funded research investments into HIV/AIDS, preventative medications, and it's also very controversially slow-walked newer HIV treatments in order to profit on their existing ones. So I say all of that because I'm curious. It seems to suggest that labor unions and nonprofits conceive of their political interests and allies quite differently from one another. And I'm curious what you think about that, but also how do we navigate that tension, particularly as every day when I open up my computer, I see a new attack on queer rights, for instance?
Yeah. Wow. Great question, Joanne. The way because I've rattled this around in my head quite a bit. The way that I could surmise it the best is that one involves saviorism and the other one involves empowerment, right? An empowerment of the people, empowerment of the movements, empowerment of coming together, the empowerment of the workers. It looks very different when you are empowering co-workers to come together, because there is this element of education that comes across, and in reality, what it leads to is less dehumanization. Like, people are humanizing each other in these struggles, right? Because labor and the labor movement as it stands is the socioeconomic vessel to like upward movement and mobility in the United States of America. Plus, labor sets the bar. If they could, they would pay us nothing. We would literally be making cents on a dollar, right? Much like many of the imprisoned workers that are unfortunately victims underneath mass incarceration, who are making pennies on the dollar while corporations get to gobble up plenty of profit off of their exploited labor. But in reality, labor as it stands in NLRA, labor movements and unions have really set the bar. And many corporations have no choice but to pay people based off of what it is that they can compare to the wages that other union workers are making, just to be competitive. So ultimately, we know that the labor movement has a place in like our overall class discussion and our overall class upward mobility and our ability to like galvanize one another and to empower each other to do this work. And I don't want to go like too far off, because I could say so much about like the nonprofit like complex and structure in the United States. And it's called a nonprofit, but the profitization of so much like struggle and so much oppression and so much hardship. Because ultimately a nonprofit's job should be to put itself out of business, but we don't see that necessarily happening. And that's not to say that people won't always need help, but considering how much money has been funneled like away from like mutual aid resources or from like direct action resources into nonprofit spheres, it is difficult to see like millions of dollars we put out there, but like people just can't like afford rent or housing or like access to their medication or like medical resources. Whereas if you are a worker and these things are contractually stipulated in your CBA, you gain access again. Like for me, a big part of like navigating all of the hardships that we have as like queer and trans people in the United States is the worker issue, right? People need jobs, well-paying jobs at that, and they need the resources and the ability to empower themselves and to steadfast their own movements and to bolster their own needs, both that are, you know, covered underneath wages and benefits, but like their dignity and respect on the job. But I'm kind of getting into the weeds, but that's just kind of my perspective. It's leaning away from the saviorism, right? Like the valor and like the savior complexes, and leaning more into like rooting the empowerment and the solidarity and organizing back into like the workers and what it means for us to be a working class. Because yeah, like queer rights are labor rights, trans rights are labor rights, like, but ultimately humanizing one another and coming together is the only way that we are going to unravel all of these things within the political spectrum. And you really can do that in an environment such as a workplace. When you have the education and the humanization of one another, you start to care for one another. The care is what has left the building, right? The apathy is what is so rampant. And that's because people are miserable. People are miserable underneath their labor. They recognize they're being exploited. They're not getting to see any of their production come back to them in a tangible way. But instead of reaching out to others for support, they gave them someone to point at. And that's a heck of a lot easier than it is to perform the labor of actually coming together.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, I'm still spiritually a wobbly in the like old-fashioned Joe Hill kind of way. And, you know, the industrial workers of the world slogans where the working class and the owning class have nothing in common. And I think there's almost nowhere that makes that more clear than these like awards to companies for inclusion in the workplace, because you know, the Human Rights Campaign gives awards to Amazon, they give awards to Starbucks, they give awards to all of these companies that, you know, maybe have a handful of people elevated to high positions. I was sitting in captive audience meetings with Starbucks executives who were all like, you know, trying to signal how they too were gay and had climbed this corporate ladder. And so you had, you know, Rosanne Williams, the president of Starbucks North America, being like, yeah, my wife and I were on our business trip together. And then everybody else was like, oh yeah, me and my wife. And then the ones who didn't have wives were talking about their love for Katie Lang and, you know, trying to appeal. But, you know, I think it's really, do you want a queer liberation movement on the lines of, you know, Leslie Feinberg and union rights and like changing conditions for everybody? Or do you want, you know, a few people maybe getting to climb the corporate ladder and then, you know, putting a pink washed boot on other people's necks? So, yeah.
Yeah, and I just thank you so much for that, Jazz, because we could spend a lot of time having a conversation. I'm sure we will in the back end. But there is something to be said for like the outright tokenization, right? Like it was so almost too easy for the tokenism to like really take hold and for people to like either puppet or like parrot out like these people like, oh, like look at us, we are just so inclusive, you know, people have the ability to climb all these ladders and to reach these positions of leadership. And if you ever have the opportunity, or maybe the not so much an opportunity, to be in like spaces with these folks and like get into like the actual conversations, you will realize like within all of that ladder climbing, there was actually a lot of authority that was like ushered away. So some of these folks are being outright tokenized, like they're in these positions of leadership that are faux leadership. Ultimately, they don't really have the ability to make any real decisions that are going to be impactful to like their community members or the people that patronize their businesses or to their workers as well. Their whole job is to like be this very performative, like liberal-esque mouthpiece for the organization or for the company in an attempt to, again, co-opt movements and to stagnate movements. It's all just to like persuade us that things are not as bad as they are and to persuade us to not take up certain facets of the movement that are desperately in need. So that was just I just wanted to round back on you on that.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I couldn't agree more with so much of what you are all saying. And I actually thought of a quick follow-up, which is some folks might say like, okay, these nonprofits oftentimes fight for legal civil rights, and they're the ones advancing cases in the courts. And I don't think that we want to say that we don't want some of those organizations doing that kind of work. And I don't hear what either of you saying that. I hear that it's a broader struggle. But I'm also curious, like thinking about what you all have seen unions be able to do for queer workers. Have you seen collective bargaining agreements protect queer workers in ways that maybe federal civil rights law, weak as it is not very good at doing?
I think just having just cause alone, companies have all kinds of ways of firing people in retaliatory ways without explicitly labeling what that is. And, simply having union protections from unfair discipline and termination alone is a huge thing. Starbucks Workers United is fighting for, comprehensive protections for trans and queer workers from, preventing Starbucks from being able to roll back gender affirming care coverage to like ensuring that it would be precedent setting protections for workers. Obviously, that's still in progress, and Starbucks has also been trying to roll back a lot of their statements while also preserving their base to the extent they can do both. But I think I've worked with a lot of different restaurant and coffee shop workers, and there's a huge marginalization of trans workers to kitchens and to back of house jobs. So you have, trans workers really relegated to an industry that has, almost no union density, and really wild health and safety violations, and incredibly precarious employment. And so I think people are seeing unionizing as the only way to win those rights, both, kind of through the traditional union contract protections and, new and more innovative language designed specifically around these issues.
Yeah, I mean, Jazz pretty much just said it. Unions as an entity have the ability to hold corporations accountable. So not only to like the language underneath the collective bargaining agreement, but to their own policies and procedures as well, right? Because I mean, you see this a lot in like arbitration prep. Like if the grievance process gets all the way to arbitration with witnesses and preparation and everything else, an arbitrator is going to be looking at not only the contract, but also did the corporation abide by its own policies? Like basically you have to stand 10 toes down in your own convictions. If that is not the case, then obviously, the person that has been victimized underneath all of this becomes the awardee. So the accountability piece is there for workers to be able to stand up, fight for their rights, but to also navigate the grievance process so that way you can uncover a lot of things. Like typically whenever we would go into like new contract negotiations, we tend to go back to all of our previous grievances, right? Like we have documentation to see like how it is that we need to revitalize or like create better like foundation within our contractual language that's going to support all workers, especially if you see an issue come up over and over again. So there's that accountability piece. And then just like overall, to back up what Jazz said surrounding like benefits, you see in a lot of these spaces where like the state's laws come down, but ultimately the language in the contract is the contract. Like we always say, the contract is the contract is the contract. So there's a lot of different provisions that we've come up with, like different language models we've come up with, kind of akin to what we did after Roe v. Wade was overturned, which is if your employee has negotiated this benefit and is no longer has access to it, or dependent no longer has access to it because of your state's laws, then you need to provide like extra support for their expenses for them to transport themselves or their dependent out of state to receive like the very necessary like medical, oftentimes emergency medical care that folks need. So you just always have like a vessel. You always have like a way of like moving the ball back into the workers' court to make things better, regardless of which you come up against. And one point that people tend to overlook entirely is that unions have PACs. Unions have PACs. They have the ability to play ball within the political spectrum, right? Now, mind you, your dues do not go directly to PACs because that happened underneath the Supreme Court some decades ago. We're not going to get into that part. But union workers have the ability to voluntarily contribute to a union's PAC fund, right? So when you hear people say, oh, but my dues shouldn't be going to politics, they aren't unless you volunteer them. Like you have to voluntarily tell your union, like, hey, I want some of my dues money or some of my money, that comes out of my wages to go specifically like towards this PAC. But they have the ability to lean on different politicians, whether they be incumbents or whether they be opponents, to drive the union messaging, right? And also surrounding like our social and our basic human rights as well. Like if you have a politician that is going to be anti-LGBTQ or, is going to be anti-DI or whatever the case may be, like you have a major labor union PAC, you have the ability to say, well, we're going to go for the person that's running against you because they are not doing those things, or their messaging is different, or they're actually willing to work with us across all of the diversity of our workforce, because ultimately, as unions, we have a duty of representation to every person, regardless of their intersections, regardless of their backgrounds, regardless with how they identify. That is the job. Legally, that is the job. So unions have the ability to play court in an area where most individuals do not. And if you are active in your union, you have the ability to pick your leadership that is also going to drive those sentiments and values forward as well. So as a worker underneath the union, you play a large role in defining how it is your union functions, the benefits that you receive, and also can make demands of your leadership regarding the political spectrum. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, this is all extremely clarifying, because I think sometimes, yeah, when you say that, well, you need a union to protect all kinds of rights, including against discrimination on the job. Some people, I think, might say, well, you have civil rights for that, but they don't go nearly as far as all the things that we've just heard. So many more kind of robust protections happen in the context of kind of organized workers. Well, Brittany, you mentioned politics, and so I want to transition to a question about last fall, where we saw Donald Trump's campaign hit swing state voters with a barrage of these Kamala is for they, them, President Trump is for you political advertisements. And over the past few years, public opinion polls have shown declining support for a variety of LGBTQ rights issues, particularly those concerning trans people's right to use a public restroom or to access best practices in healthcare. And I'm curious what you think about why have these attacks been so effective, and what role might the labor movement play in changing that narrative? And that is a narrative which frames kind of, on the one hand, queer people are over here as these bourgeois, rootless cosmopolitan, or even globalist threats to the sanctity of a traditional family. And then on the other hand, this ostensibly straight-laced, normal, whatever that might mean, working class.
So anti-colonialist, this question is so hard for me because I'm like, man, I could be here for like an hour just talking about like all the ways the gender binary came apart at the exact same time as colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. But I won't. But if anybody's interested, you can always like DM me because we can carry on about it.
You should go for it.
Yeah, so to be clear, like the moment we got marriage equality, Republicans pivoted to trans rights, like overnight. like immediately, the Carolinas, like in the bathroom bills came out, like I think the following month. They had felt like they had lost the fight on like marriage and family, which is when your whole institution is like built upon defining what family is, defining family values. People existing underneath the LGBTQIA plus umbrella are a problem. We are a problem for them because we live outside of the constructs of all their family and nuclear definitions. So we are to them super pervasive. We are to them like having any form of representation is too pervasive because when you are trying to conquer a people, you need one band, one sound, which is how race and like a gender binary was created in the first place, right? So they're like, you need to keep your rhetoric simple. All this nuance, all this intersectionality, all of these differences and diversity. No, 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 no. We just need these people working their dead-end jobs so they can go out and buy cars because we don't have any high-speed trains or any like real public transportation. We need people just working to be in debt and to provide us all of their resources and to provide us with all of their money. And in reality, what it all comes down to is privatization of these corporations. Everything goes back to profiting the corporations, everything. Even them undermining and dehumanizing us comes back to the profit of corporations because to Jazz's point, what happens to us? We end up relegated to specific like underpaying roles. We end up underemployed. We end up with relaxed benefits. So they don't actually have to provide us with anything. There's no investment in our benefits or like in our medical care or anything of that nature. And all it does is provide profit for these corporations or for these different business entities. Like it is just all about exploiting labor. At the end of the day, because labor is really the only thing we have left to withhold in this country to actually like fight back against these corporations. Is that like us physically not taking our bodies out of the house is like one of the only ways that we can like actually fight back against all of these oligarchs at this point, right? And maintaining divisiveness like underneath the conservative banner is so necessary. It's so necessary to keep corporations profitable, to keep workers from coming together. It's so necessary to keep people miseducated and dehumanizing one another so that they don't come together for social welfare or social justice. Like they need that. They need it. Like they need, honestly, us existing is like the best thing to happen to like the conservative Republican brand in a very long time because they're not popular. They are not popular. Even their policies aren't popular. And let's be clear, them targeting trans people during the last election was because they had no real economic policy to speak of. We like trans folks and queer folks were shiny objects to keep people from looking at the fact that these folks have nothing in mind for you. There's no tax breaks for you, only for the wealthy. There's no rejuvenation or resourcing of your social programs that are going to support you and your family members and your children and your community members and your schools. They're not talking about giving any benefit to the tax-paying people of this country, even though we pay more and more taxes and get less and less back. So you need somebody because frankly, and I'm just going to say this, white supremacy is not inventive. Like over the course of history, you could take one sentence, these people are bad, and just insert a different marginalized group along the way. First, the Black people, well, the indigenous people were bad, and the Black people were bad, then Hispanics were bad, and then gay men were bad, and then it was all gay people, right? And now it's trans folks' time. It's trans folks' time to be positioned in this way because they have no real platform. They lost marriage equality. They're desperately trying to get it back. Their entire existence is on conformity, uniformity, what they detail as family values, even though I don't see anything familial about what it is that they talk about. But in reality, their entire platform is retaliatory against every other person that isn't like white, cis, and male. So it was always going to come down to trans people, even though they are such a small portion of the population, right? It was always going to come down to dehumanizing them and to painting them as boogie people because they have nothing else to talk about because they don't want to talk about anything else. They don't want their constituents actually looking at their policies and the legislation they're putting forward. They want to do everything in silos and in silence. So they make these things so loud and so in your face and are so desperate to use us as being a means of keeping their constituents preoccupied. And I refuse to be used. I refuse to be used because I'm gonna bring it back to like, okay, so you said all that to say what? What is it that you're gonna do to keep people from being homeless if they miss a single paycheck? And there are no answers. But unfortunately, the cult of Trump, the cult of MAGA, and the cult of influence that is like the current like Republican conservative talking points, I think it would take us like a really long time, and I hate to say that, but I think it would take us an excruciating long time to like undo the harm that has been done.
No, I mean, I guess kind of going off of all of that, I think to the extent that that kind of messaging and these kind of attacks are effective, it's both like maybe effective in the same way that, you know, the Lee Atwater Southern strategy is effective. Like you're mobilizing the worst, like what Kiese Lehman calls the worst of white folks, but you're mobilizing the very worst kind of punching down reactionary influences. And I think the reason that they're effective to the extent that they are is that the Democrats and you know, the nonprofit industrial complex often have no way to respond to this. So you have, you know, Gavin Newsom, which is pet peeve, I guess, is Gavin Newsom. But anyway, like saying this is a great ad. Like, would he say, like, Lee Atwater, that is a great strategy? Maybe he would. He probably would. But I think people don't know how to respond to this and don't understand solidarity. And the labor movement's role is to teach solidarity and teach people how to talk about these things and understand these things in a way that gets past, you know, the tokenizing of, I mean, like the DNC's solution is to try to have more specific slots for people who are trans and people from marginalized identities instead of like actually understanding, you know, maybe instead of having a couple of token delegates, we could actually have a strategy that mobilizes people, that really talks about all of people's intersecting identities, especially class, and, you know, gives people something to fight for and a way to understand the way that this impacts their own interests. I mean, I think the most important thing that the labor movement can do is redirect people who are punching down and give them the understanding of how to make that a punch up and, you know, who the actual problem is. And I think, you know, we're seeing a real battle in a lot of labor unions over this too. I mean, like you have Sean O'Brien, you know, saying that Josh Hawley is 100% right, even as he's talking about like, oh yeah, we have Chipotle workers and Starbucks workers like wanting to organize, and you know, Chipotle workers who organize with the Teamsters are led by trans and queer workers. And so I think unions have to not cede this ground at all. Like we have to be able to help people talk about these things in ways that are unifying and also not throwing people under the bus. And it's not that hard, but people don't really have a principled commitment to, you know, intersectionality and class struggle in all cases. So I think we can't assume that the labor movement is going to be automatically this force for justice, but I think it's also the only movement that can be this force for justice. And so we have to organize and mobilize within the labor movement too, to demand that.
I just wanted to follow up with that really quickly because I feel like so much of like the miseducation that goes around is due to like a certain amount of skepticism, right? And I can't entirely disagree with that. And I can speak from like my own position as being like a Black person within the Black community. There is all this historical context that provides for like all this skepticism. So I only know that like other marginalized communities are also facing like the same issues as well. And one thing I think, I'm not going to talk about the DNC because I can't, but one thing I will say about labor is that, you know, I've seen some like tremendous momentum be made out of like our very, what I like to call get real campaigns, like where we really get into the nitty gritty of like the circumstances, right? And we don't infantilize people. Like we educate people, we work with people, we build partnerships and cohorts with people, but we don't infantilize them. And I think that the broad American public, especially American workers, feel largely infantilized a lot of the times, talked down to, talked at, spoken over. And I think that does even exist within the labor movement. And we are seeing with labor activism as we move away from, that's not to say that we don't include, but as we move away from more historical, like industrial organizing and move more so into like more diverse sectors and industries, you're seeing a large amount of like minority and young folks coming into the labor movement that have different needs and different demands, right? That may have been historically left out of the conversation, even within their own unions, right? Because unions are not perfect. It's an amalgamation of many, many people, very many diverse people. And even still within that fact, there are still silos and pockets of power and authority that come up. And labor movements oftentimes are a direct mirror of like the social and political like standing of the United States. So sometimes even within our own labor movements, we have to look inwards, to Jazz's point, and internally organize and ask ourselves, like, what are our cultural and values, and what is it that we are actually wanting to promulgate? Like, what is our direction, and where are we sailing this boat? And is it going to be more intersectional? Is it going to be more inclusive? Is it going to be more diverse? Or are we going to hold stagnant to the line of what has always worked for us? And I think that that's like an ongoing conversation, actually, underneath the banner of the AFL-CIO, but also of many different like affiliates and partners underneath the AFL. And I think folks are working it out, but simultaneously, I would love to hear them get very real with their memberships, get very real with the public, and speak and address on these things in very real ways. Like Jazz's point, identifying like the actual problem, identifying the actual enemy. Because I do feel like both labor movements and the DNC sometimes mutually decide to maintain a certain level of decorum that, baby, we just don't got time for, okay? These people want to see you get real. And get into it and be honest. And this, in the same way they can double down on the BS, like we want to see you double down on the human rights of it all. So I just want
If
to say.
I could add one thing really fast, sorry, I think like one of the most effective ways to change union culture is also through organizing non-union workers who often have these both very pressing needs for changes within their own workplace, but also very high expectations of what the union should mean and should be, and how democracy should work within the union as well. And so, like through Starbucks Workers United, we saw huge changes within Workers United, and sometimes disagreements over what priorities should be, but through that kind of new organizing and workers demanding what their union should stand for and should be, Workers United became, at the forefront of the trans rights or labor rights struggle. Starbucks Workers United ended up taking really strong stances on Palestine very early on. And so I think you can combine all of these things, but also like organizing your own workplace, organizing unorganized workers also has huge effects in terms of changing what the union looks like internally as well.
We actually have a couple questions from the Q&A, and I think I'll start throwing some of these into our discussion because they speak kind of very much to everything that you all have just kind of put on the table for us. And some folks are asking questions like, do you have other specific examples of instances of building effective coalition and campaigns that we can learn from? And I'll throw in with theirs, other folks are interested in what that looks like, especially when organizing a younger generation of advocates or different industries than we're used to kind of focusing on.
Okay, so only locally, I'll be honest, like I don't have anything nationally outside of Starbucks Workers United, which we love. Proud I work love Starbucks Workers United. We've been really glad to be a part of like their different cohorts and campaigns and to like support their work and efforts, because obviously underneath our constituency group representing LGBTQI plus union workers all over the country, like we obviously welcome them under our fold. So that's been a major campaign. But locally, we actually have organized some nonprofits that directly service LGBTQI plus workers underneath the union banner, like in Pittsburgh, PA, United Steelworkers Organized per SOD, and having a team of like mental health professionals and community outreach resource social workers come underneath the union, to Jazz's point, really changed some facets of the culture of like the union within itself. Now you have like actual experts that are like in these spaces and that are able to vet so many of the different language or outcomes that can say emphatically like, hey, like this is great, or hey, no, this is awful, like don't ever do this again. But for me, ultimately what we hope to champion and we hope to see is through Pride at Work, some of our advancing the language that I just outlined a second ago that we would like to see. We hope to reach out to more unorganized workers to let them know, or to persuade them and to empower them to get active. We have a multitude of different affiliates and union partners as being an AFL-CIO constituency group that we can pull together resources, rather quickly, far more quickly than like some other organizations are able to. And by resources, I don't really just mean money. I mean like access to lists, access to people, and the ability to get messaging out fairly quickly. But what we're seeing is like the need to be socially active within social media, but also create spaces that are in person, that utilize our chapters. Pride at Work has chapters. So like we have DC chapters, we have like a Rocky Mountain chapter, to organize people within their unions and other unorganized workers through our collaborations in regional spaces, because just like we all have different intersections and we're all different people have different issues depending on where they are, like where their environments are in the United States, and workers should have the ability to like fight against the different ways that they're oppressed in their specific areas. Yeah, that's like my tidbit. It's hard. I'm not gonna front. Just because like we have become like so heavily reliant on social media. So much of this work really does have to be done face to face. Some people don't even feel comfortable speaking out online, even if it is anonymous. So it really does mean getting back to like some of those grassroots efforts of like going out and talking to people in person. And creating spaces like in person for people to come together and to speak about their different issues. But yeah, no, it's something that we're all trying to figure out exactly what it looks like for a younger generation, but we're also taking our cues from them because like they also know how to communicate with each other.
No, I mean, I think I've worked on a huge number of campaigns, and there's always, even at workforces that you think are the most, quote unquote, homogenous, like even within Starbucks, you have all of these different groups, all of these different, ages and races and, or there are a handful of straight men at Starbucks, and we've had union members who are straight men, and we try not to tokenize them. But I think, I guess I want to talk for a second about a campaign that we were working on in Buffalo at Tesla. And the campaign started among the Tesla autopilot workers, who were predominantly very young, mostly former baristas, who were working, labeling the data for self-driving cars. And so that was a workforce that was, based in an office environment. They were clocked and like monitored by keystrokes down to the second. And so like their issues were, not being able to take bathroom breaks, but also wider ranging, including, what the hell was Elon Musk doing? And, he was treating workers terribly, was also cracking down on things like the Jedi chat, which was their justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion chat. And then the campaign expanded into the production side, where you had, gross inequities between workers who were, being hired through temp agencies, who were, from lots of different immigrant communities. Buffalo has a very large refugee population, and so you have all these companies that are trying to intentionally hire folks that they think won't be as able to organize or as willing to, put their job on the line. And I think Elon Musk responded by firing 40 workers, and there were internal union jurisdictional issues that prevented us from being able to organize. because unions basically were more interested in fighting over who got to organize these workers theoretically rather than supporting workers organizing. And it's like, guys, we could have had a union at Tesla, and who cares who gets the members later? Let's just organize a union at Tesla. But I think that was people were coming together from all of these different jobs and backgrounds. The factory workers were working 12-hour shifts, 4 days, and then 3 days. So these marathon jobs. And I think, regardless of the specific issues or the specific identities, people understood the need for a union and the need for solidarity, especially against a company like that. And so, yeah, pitch to the labor movement is like, we've got to get better at just supporting organizing and caring less about who gets to do what.
It's a really important point. And it relates to another question I had, which was, how are we navigating the labor law situation right now? With the state of the National Labor Relations Board being kind of thrown into such kind of question. And we know it was already dire before the last year's ruling in the Starbucks fees McKinney case, which I know that Jazz, you have written about. But I'm just curious, like, we're getting a lot of questions in the chat about how are we supposed to navigate the situation now with these strategies that we're talking about?
Well, the NLRB was left without quorum for a little bit there, but they've recently been reinstated, so I guess we'll see what comes of it. I mean, honestly, I have no good answers. I feel like it points to like a bigger issue, which is that we've had these problems for like a really long time. We were kind of just like coasting along on good graces for a while and on nostalgia and good feelings, but ultimately we've had issues since the very beginning. I mean, the NRA, this includes like domestic workers as it stands and farm workers, of which had we had the ability to organize some of those folks, we may have had better opportunities as it stands now, surrounding people's legal status and like worker status and visa status underneath the United States. But that's neither here nor there. That's hindsight 2020. What I will say is that we are going to see some really interesting cases come down the pike. We're going to see some, I have no faith in the Supreme Court as it stands. The unions are obviously fighting, the different cohorts are obviously fighting legally underneath the law. And you'll see some of the lower judges come back with judgments that make a lot of sense. They're actually following the law, but ultimately the appeals process goes where it goes. And there is no telling necessarily what the outcome will be, if this court will actually uphold all of the precedents and all of the laws that are actually on the books, or if they'll just pivot to, for lack of better phrasing, screwing over all of us. So we're in a precarious position, but I feel that way about everything. So I'm like, when you hit rock bottom, there's only one place to go but up, right? So it's like, we've seen all the ways that like we can be harmed. We've seen all the ways that like all of our fortitudes have been like unraveled, but they weren't that sturdy to begin with. Like, we need something sturdier in place anyways, right? Like, we've basically just been taking what we can get for the longest time, but now we're going to have to fight really, really hard to demand what it is that we need, because we can continuously find ourselves in the same cycle and in the same position over and over and over again. So I say all this to say, we're in for a labor fight. Absolutely. The unions and the AFL are putting a tremendous amount of resources behind all of this to continue to uphold the laws that are on the books, and to ensure that the NLRA remains that, or remains the National Labor Relations Act. But ultimately, it does open up the door for like some bigger questions from folks, especially folks coming into unions or like younger activists. And by younger, I mean like folks like 50 and under. I'm gonna be honest, because the labor union can be like very like, our ages are all over the place, right? But like, you have folks that are not nearing anywhere. Basically, younger people for me in the labor movement are people that are nowhere near retirement. Like, if you know you're not retiring, you a younger worker in the force, right? But there are definitely some needs that like we have, and through all these fights, through all this precedence that's going to be set over the next few years, we may be able to like actually see our needs come into the fold of the conversation.
When we're training folks at the Inside Organizer School on how they're going to be able to win their organizing campaigns. We often always tell them that it boils down to two main things. You need a committee and a representative committee and strong worker support, and then you need a hammer. And your hammer is what you're going to bring down on the company to win the right to organize. And sometimes the hammer is elusive, and sometimes it seems like you're going to need a comically big Wile E. Coyote kind of hammer that might be hard to assemble if you're up against one of the biggest companies. But I think public pressure is often that hammer, or almost always that hammer, in most situations, even at a company like Nissan. And I've never seen the law be that hammer. So I think, with Starbucks, a lot of people were like, oh my God, the NLRB is proving itself by finding for the union in all of these different, ALJ trials, helping reinstate the Memphis 7. And like, yes, it was helpful to a point to have that happen. And you can use unfair labor practice decisions to help tell the public what's going on, but that's not going to make a company fold. And Starbucks still has no contract despite, this supposedly great NLRB. I could get more into how the great NLRB was actually not great, even at its best, and how the regional director in Buffalo is married to a union busting lawyer. Many things going on there. They did not reinstate the workers at Tesla that Elon fired after we went public, even after we appealed to Jennifer Abruzzo. This could be a much longer rant, but all of that to say, the law has always not been on our side. It's going to get worse, but we have to figure out ways of bringing down public pressure on companies. I mean, I think the Tesla takedowns are showing that you can inflict a lot of damage with a lot of public support and pressure. So, yeah, I think if we merged those kinds of mobilizations and right to organize struggles, we could get very far, even without the law.
Jazz, you're spot on. And I will say that, like, I feel like sometimes the labor movement kind of pushes away from some of that kind of like anti-consumerism or like boycotting rhetoric, because like ultimately they're like, oh, but this can like negatively impact the workers, right? Like it can impact their ability to work or their hours or whatever the case may be, yada, yada. The same goes for work stoppages. And I am being very specific about the word work stoppages, right? Like ultimately some folks feel like this can have like really negative impacts against workers, but ultimately the public also includes workers, right? Like if we were not working, we would not be the consumer public. So like, because without wages, you can't buy things. So ultimately, like I feel that we will inevitably kind of have to turn away from some of those ideas of always like managing to keep the worker and like the consumer conversation separate. Workers are consumers. Workers do drive the economy in all ways through their labor and production of the work, but also through their consumerism on the back end. So all of these things are intertwined, which means that our recourse can be such as well. So I'm in full agreement with you on that. The laws are not perfect, and we deserve something better, in my opinion. But ultimately, yeah, like public pressure, community pressure more than anything, because you would not believe the psychological damage that can be performed when you have a horde of people riding by an establishment on the hour, every hour for many, many days with the same air horns over and over and over again. So like there's a lot of different strategies that you can utilize, and with community support, these things happen. But workers even have to have time to be a part of their communities to build up that community support, and that's another conversation.
Yeah, it brings to mind, and I encourage folks to look into the history of the Corps' boycotts that began in the 1970s too. And I think that's an example of there were some successes and failures in the Corps' boycott, but it does show kind of adding that consumer side, adding that organizing outside of the actual kind of workplace. That's kind of essential here. I have another question from the Q&A that basically asks, and I relate this to kind of a little bit of what Jazz said about you need a representative committee and you need a hammer. Did I get that right?
Yes.
You need a representative committee, you need a hammer. And so in thinking about how to develop those things, have you seen in practice that involve workers coming to understand or even having some conflicts over what that committee should look like and kind of what issues should be brought into the organizing space? Basically thinking about how there might be conflicts within an organizing drive or a labor union, but maybe also how the struggle together helps make differences among workers kind of diminish when they see the gains of kind of building solidarity with one another.
Jazz, if you're still racking your brain, I can say something small. One thing I
Yeah.
will say is anytime you build cohort or coalition, there's going to be problems. And I mean real problems, like personality problems, background problems, intersectional problems. So I don't want to dissuade anybody from doing so. Just know walking into the situation, it is not going to be arm in arm, hand in hand, like we're going to sit around the campfire and sing songs, because people are bringing their very real lived experiences. They're bringing trauma. They're bringing, different ways that they've been discriminated against or that they have been harmed, both inside and outside of the workplace. Heck, they're bringing community trauma into the fold. So like my first recommendation is to open the floor to provide and to create a protective space of like listening and understanding and healing so that people can learn from each other first, right? Like just get to know the people like in your cohort, especially if you're going to be working closely together on like an organizing campaign over many, many months, if not longer than a year or two. Get to know folks first, because understanding each other is going to help bridge the gap between miscommunications. And then ultimately also be prepared to like actively listen more than you speak, and also be willing to like negotiate. Same way you're going to negotiate with an employer, you're going to have to negotiate with each other, because you cannot let perfection be like the evil of good. Ultimately, like folks have to be so organized that they know what like their top 10 agenda items are. And inevitably in good organizing, you get everybody to agree to these things. Like we are on this page, and like we're not going to leave anybody behind. It's not to say that there aren't like more issues that we need to like speak on directly, but ultimately we need to get these things so that way like we can show up as the force that we are to like deal with the other things on the back end, right? Because you have to show and prove first, especially with these employers and especially within these organizing campaigns. Like they have to know that y'all be ready to like roll deep at any moment before like they'll see like any ground to you. But yeah, that's just been my experience, is like sometimes people walk into these spaces and there's like so much chatter, or there's like so much back and forth, or there's like so much disagreement that folks feel like they are set up for failure, like right out the gate. And that's not it. These are just the growing pains of like any collaboration.
No, I mean, I think I've seen a huge variety of types of workplaces organizing and, fighting for, both simply the right to organize through, a first organizing campaign process, and then, different demands in their first contracts. I think committees often become slightly insular, and, the job is always to make sure that your messaging isn't for the committee, whether that's because your committee is too radical, too comprised of, one of the workplace groups. I think, I've seen unionized places that are, for example, like a majority Punjabi workplace in Toronto, where other folks from other backgrounds didn't feel like they could get as involved because they simply didn't have, both the community and language majorities that a lot of their coworkers had. So I think making sure that unions are intentionally finding ways to bring people in. I mean, Starbucks tried to hire, after having years and years of discriminatory hiring practices and having largely white and white passing baristas, started hiring Black workers into the Buffalo cafes that were going to union votes in hopes that they could divide workers on racial lines. Starbucks had the same law firm that Nissan had used, and Littler Mendelsohn, and they did very similar things, sort of in reverse, because Nissan was majority Black, and they would try to pit the white workers against the Black workers. And then Starbucks was, majority white, and they would try to tell the new Black workers, like, don't trust your coworkers who are trying to sell you on the union. Like, do they really have your back? So I think making sure that your organizing efforts are going out of your way to include everybody and, like, have real organizing conversations and try to make sure that people truly do have ways to join the effort. There was a union campaign that's still ongoing because nonprofits can't stop retaliating, but at an art museum in Buffalo. And there were a couple of workers who were Indian workers who had gotten jobs at the museum and didn't speak much English. And so there were no other Hindi speakers on the committee. Management had, told these workers that they would be losing, hundreds of dollars to dues automatically as soon as they voted the union in. So there was a lot of fear. But the committee was like, okay, these folks are anti-union, and, like, didn't really try to make a lot of effort. We ended up getting a translator from a union in India who woke up at 4:30 in the morning and joined a call with these workers. And then they were able to actually have a conversation, get their questions answered, and they were pro-union. They wanted to be involved. So obviously making sure that you have proactive strategies for getting folks involved. And also, sometimes that does mean having conversations with other coworkers about why it is so important to not close doors. One last tangent, but Starbucks had their own inclusion and diversity awards as a corporation. They on multiple occasions gave those awards to Littler Mendelsohn, theirs, and Nissan's union busting law firm. So another beautiful example of how phony that world is.
Truly, truly phony. Well, these are like such wonderful, kind of instructive and really practical pieces of advice, I think, to folks who are thinking about how to create these kind of representative committees and to organize in their own workforces. We are kind of getting to the end of our time, so I just wanted to ask both of you if there are any final remarks that you wanted to kind of end us on here.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. I mean, we said so much here. The conversation has been so great. Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Jazz, for all of it, because I really do feel like I'm kikiing around around a bonfire with both of you. But ultimately, what I want to say to folks is it truly is a class struggle. There are some, like, legitimate elephants in the room, obviously, surrounding, like, race and gender, gender expression and identity, that have just, like, taken root in a way that culturally we have to overcome slowly but surely. And that's only going to get done by getting to know each other, getting to know one another's struggles, seeing where, like, we're similarly impacted, but also, like, recognizing our differences and not washing them away, right? Like, not suggesting that one's oppression is somehow going to, like, overlook another person's oppression. Because for me, as, like, a Black queer woman in America, a descendant of slaves in the United States, I got a lot I could talk about, and a lot of different ways that, like, I know that I'm being unduly impacted, that some other folks frankly don't have to navigate. But people won't know unless I tell them. Because, and I want to speak from my lived experience anyways. So my piece of advice to folks is to, like, share your stories and start talking to people and in spaces that, like, you haven't done so before. Start inviting people into your spaces from places that you haven't done so previously, and start looking around at each other for, like, legitimate community. Like, it's right here. I understand. But get off of this. I've built amazing community via social media. Truly, my Signal chat groups go up, but I really got into, like, the practice of like really talking to my neighbors and talking to folks around my neighborhood, even when I'm just like running up to like the convenience store or going in a hair store that's up the street or into Ace Hardware or whatever the case may be, like asking, like just getting into conversations with folks. And those conversations always go further. We are like intrinsically like tethered to each other in the way that we rely on each other for a lot of different things. And I think that our independence has really made it impossible for some folks to see themselves as standing in solidarity with each other. But in reality, we are not separated from each other, and our class struggles surely are not separated from each other. And every time I open the door for like the class struggle conversation, even in the grocery store, me and this little old white lady was just talking about groceries the other day and how the packages got smaller and like how the things don't seem to go further and how she can bake less cookies now for her grandkids. And it was just a great conversation. And then she asked me what I did for work. And she told me how she was a teacher for like 35 years and all these other things. But like, I know when I see her again, we have already built rapport, we already have community. And if I were to go up to her and ask her if she would support something, she would likely say yes. Right? Back to Jazz's point surrounding like a public persuasion and community engagement. And could ask another person, because once you have the trust of another person, more likely than not, they are going to trust your judgment. Oh, not my internet's unstable. Anyways, I'm going to wrap it up. I invite all of you to internally organize. If you're already organized, keep the chains of communication open between you and all of the other workers. And if you have any interest in getting out and working with unorganized workers, that is awesome. Definitely read Jazz's book and also ask your union how it is that you can get involved in those efforts. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think we've covered a lot. I guess I would say I think one important thing, and this isn't always easy, and also it's not always everyone's job to have every conversation. And so I think sometimes, having your union colleague or your organizing committee comrade, sometimes be the one to address the people who are punching down and start turning those things around. Maybe the most marginalized people don't always have to be the ones doing that work. But I think it's incredibly important to give people pathways back into the movement and into reframing the way that they're thinking about these things. And I mean, I think I've seen multiple times folks who've crossed a picket line during one strike become leaders of a subsequent strike, or folks who are anti-union during an organizing committee become part of the bargaining committee, become union stewards. And I think the labor movement also is one of the few places where people truly can sort out a lot of their preconceived ideas and a lot of the indoctrination that they've gotten from society. And so I think keeping those doors open to the extent possible, and with the understanding that, maybe some folks are going to have more bandwidth for those conversations than others, is incredibly important, and also like one of the ways that we're going to change society back into something that's more equitable and more inclusive. And yeah, I think if you don't have a job if you have a job, you should organize. If you don't have a job, you should get a job and organize, which is what we try to help folks do through the Inside Organizer School. So yeah, would always love to talk to folks who are interested in organizing or becoming SALTs and Inside Organizers.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. These are such inspiring and kind of, again, pragmatic, useful things for people to take away in a moment where I know that I personally can succumb to despair sometimes, but obviously there's no time for that. And I think you all give great advice for people who want to do something and affect some change in their workplace and beyond. So thank you so much again to both of you. Thank you so much for the organizers of the event. And thanks so much, everyone in the audience who's been here today and shared your kind of questions with us.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.